Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today we are canning cranberry juice. And part of this came up, I belong to a ball canning group on Facebook, thinking that I was going to join it for recommendations and reviews on ball recipes. And it turns out that it's mostly a beginning canner site. I would say 90 to 95% of the questions are people that are brand new to canning. And one of the things that's come up a lot on there is people that are making cranberry juice. There's a recipe going around where you take whole cranberries, you throw them in the jar, you add some water, you add some sugar, you put a lid on it, you throw them in your canner. Don't make cranberry juice that way for a couple of reasons. One, it's not a tested recipe. And the reason it's not a safe tested recipe is because cranberries are full of air. They have an air pocket in the center of them. And there's no way to guarantee that those cranberries are actually going to pop over the course of the cooking. And so it's very possible that you're just going to have cranberries in your water that never actually pop and break open, which means they never really release their flavor. And they also don't release their acidity into that juice, which means you have no idea what the acidity of that juice is. And also, even if it worked, you've got a jar full of cranberries that you're supposed to work around when you pour it out for juice to have cranberry juice. That makes no sense to me. So I'm going to show you the tested way to make cranberry juice. This recipe comes from the Canadian version of ball. I'll put the name up on the screen because it always has an extra syllable and I always mispronounce it. But this is the Canadian version of ball, and it's very simple. It's just equal volumes of fresh cranberries, or frozen cranberries for that matter, and water. So in my case, it was a 2-pound bag of cranberries that ended up being about 9 cups of cranberries. So I added 9 cups of liquid to that, brought that all to a boil, smashed the ones that hadn't broken open because there's always a few, I think it's probably because they're slightly less ripe, that don't pop with the heat, which is, again, the reason why you don't can them just by throwing whole cranberries into a jar. So pop them so that they actually all open up, and then strain them through. I just used a regular strainer, so nothing fancy. I'll probably, when I get ready to actually put it in the jars, I'll probably run it through a finer mesh strainer, but I don't care if there's a little bit of residue in there. I don't want it to be perfectly clear. That doesn't bother me a bit if it's not. And I'm gonna get a cranberry juice that I know is safe and tested and that I don't have to worry about. In terms of sweetening, the sweetening is optional. Cranberries are virtually inedible when they're not sweetened because they are so sour. And so we're gonna need to add some kind of a sweetener. I just Googled like how much sugar is in regular cranberry juice, and it came out to about 1/8 of a cup, or about 1 ounce per cup of cranberry juice. I'm gonna cut that in half. I've got about 2 quarts here of cranberry juice. It hasn't been sweetened yet. And so I'm gonna add, what is that? 2 quarts is 8 cups, which would be, if I was following the typical cranberry juice, that would be about a cup or 8 ounces of regular sugar. I'm gonna try a half a cup and see how it tastes and see if it's sweet enough. I could also use heat-safe non-sweeteners to this. I think stevia works in that case, probably allulose as well. I don't mind having a little bit of sugar in here. I just don't need it to be as sweet as a typical store-bought cranberry juice, which is one of the reasons that it's worth making it yourself, because you control the amount of sweetness. And then also obviously no high fructose corn syrup. So I'm just using regular organic sugar in this and not high fructose corn syrup. So if you can get cranberries as a screaming deal on clearance after Thanksgiving, which is not unusual, throw them in the freezer and make this at your leisure, or make it right away. But a really nice thing to have on your pantry shelves. My husband loves cranberry juice, and I know that he will drink this right away. This is not a huge recipe that I'm making. It's probably gonna make a couple quarts, which we'll go through fairly quickly. It's more of a proof of concept because I wanted to try it and see how it came out. The other thing is you can do things with the pulp that's left over. It's not gonna have a lot of flavor because most of that flavor is now gonna be in the juice, and it's going to be of unknown acidity, which means you can't can it because we don't know how acidic it is. But I think it would be great just as a yogurt topping or mixed into making homemade muffins. So I added a little bit of sugar to what was left, and then I added some orange juice and some orange zest and a little bit of lemon juice because it really didn't seem very tart at all. And I threw it in the fridge, and we'll use that in some recipes. I'm actually thinking of mixing it into a baked loaf of bread, kind of like you would do a cinnamon raisin bread, but I'm going to try dried cranberries and cranberry sauce in a loaf of bread and see if we can come up with a sweet breakfast bread that might be fun as a new recipe to try. So I'm going to play around with that. But cranberry juice done the safe, tested way where you don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to spoil on the shelf. Let's get started. So as mentioned, this is a 2-pound or 32-ounce bag of cranberries. And when you measure that out by volume, you end up with about 9 cups. And then to this, I'm going to add 9 cups of water. And I didn't think about the size of this pot and the fact that the cranberries were going to float. This is a 3.5 quart pot, and it did not quite fit. So you'll see that I'm switching to a 5 quart pot. And then these berries were frozen, and so I'm just breaking them up because when they get hit by that water, they tend to stick together. So get everything loosened up, put the lid on, and I'm going to bring this to a simmer. And you can hear that the cranberries are starting to pop, and that's an indication that they're getting, fully cooked on the inside. But I always have a whole bunch that don't actually pop. So this was bringing it up to a simmer. It'd probably been boiling for about a minute. Some of the cranberries were popping, and I gave it a good stir, put the lid back on, and let it cook for probably at least another 5 minutes or so. So here's 5 minutes in. You can see still a lot of floating cranberries. Definitely not everything has popped. Gave it another couple minutes, came back. It didn't seem like a lot of change between the first and the second time, and so I decided to get out my potato masher and just mash those cranberries up. I probably could have done the same thing with a stick blender or an immersion blender, and I imagine the other alternative here is to just actually break your cranberries up in a food processor before you start cooking them at all, and so that would have been another option, but I just didn't want to get my food processor dirty. So here's our resulting slurry, and then this is just a standard mesh strainer. This is called a Cambo, this big container. They're really common at restaurant supply stores, and they are so good for this kind of work. They're not super expensive, and having these kind of large containers, if you do a lot of preservation, is priceless. I use this for all different kinds of things. It's really nice that they have measurements on the side. And then I couldn't quite get everything into my strainer, of course, because you always have to stop. So gave this a bit of a stir. What happens is all the little pieces and parts from the cranberries start clogging up all the holes in the sieve, and your actual liquid coming through slows way, way down, and it makes a big difference when you stir it up a little bit. So got everything into the strainer and gave it some stirring in order to get as much liquid out of there as possible. And then I just walked away and let it drain for a while. And then once things are almost done, it becomes kind of a mass, and you can sort of flip it in there and get the very last of the juice out. And I would say, all told, I probably let this sit for 20 minutes or so. Here's the resulting pulp, and as I mentioned, I ended up adding about a half a cup of sugar to the pulp that was left, along with the juice and zest of an orange and half of a lemon that I had sitting around. And then I just stirred that together, heated it, and then threw it in the fridge as a cranberry sauce. Definitely not nearly as flavorful as if it is from fresh whole cranberries. So you lose a lot by losing all of that liquid, which isn't surprising because that's the point. So this is a permanent gold coffee filter that I can just throw in the dishwasher when I'm not using it. I love it for these kind of applications. I'm not a big fan of straining things through cheesecloth. I feel like it never really gets clean again when I wash it in my washing machine afterwards, and it tends to fall apart and wad up. And so I just love this for doing fine straining. So here's the last of that 2 quarts of cranberry juice that I had strained out. And you can see same thing, everything becomes kind of a raft. And I ended up throwing this very fine pulp into that other cranberry mixture. So it gave it a little bit more flavor. I'm adding here a half a cup of sugar. Just do it to taste. The sugar is not in there for safety. It is strictly in there for flavor. And then rather than bringing this to a full boil, the instructions indicate bringing it to 190 degrees for 5 minutes. And so I actually used a thermometer. You're basically kind of pasteurizing
pasteurizing it rather than bringing it to a boil. There was a little bit of scum that had floated to the top, and so I did screen off some of the raft of stuff that was on the top. It was pretty minimal. And then I'm putting this into my jars, and you want a 1/4-inch headspace, so pretty small. Usually really thin liquids like this, where there isn't a lot of density, have a much smaller headspace than something that's thick. I'm sure if you were canning actual cranberry sauce, it would probably be a slightly bigger headspace. My kingdom for pots that I can pour out of without it running down the side. God help me. So double checking that headspace. This is a nice little handy tool for doing that. And I was a little bit short, and so I'm just pulling from that extra jar of cranberry juice that I didn't need for the 2 quarts and topping those up just slightly. And now we're where we want to be. So I'm going to wipe my rims, put on new lids, not used lids. There are people out there that will reuse lids, but for the 25 to 40 cents that a lid costs, I'm not going to waste all of this work because something didn't seal because I was reusing a lid. And then a ring, and then finger tight, which usually means I feel it just start to grab, and then a slightly past that. And then into my hot canner. This water in here has already been hot. So hot jars, hot water in the canner. And then I had a little bit of cranberry juice left over. We're just gonna throw it in the fridge and drink it. But here's a recipe for cosmopolitans, which is the classic use for fresh cranberry juice. This pot is just barely big enough to actually can quarts in, so you want about 1 inch of water above the top of the canner. 15 minutes in the canner once it comes back to a full boil. And then turn the canner off, let it sit for 5 minutes with the jars in there. This just helps ensure a better seal. And this is a more recent addition to the Ball canning guidelines with the new types of seals that they have. This is a different compound from the old stuff that you might have used with your grandma. And there you have it. Beautiful, homemade, safe, shelf-stable cranberry juice. Give this recipe a try, tribe. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.